The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation. Constituency Report is produced as a public service by members of the BC Legislature through the facilities of Shaw TV.
Hello and welcome to Constituency Report on Shaw TV. I'm Megan Mills, and joining me in the studio today is the new Democrat MLA for Victoria Swan Lake, Rob Fleming. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Thanks for having me.
Great. So Rob, you're also the education critic, and I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about the latest education budget.
Yeah, I mean, education has been a ministry that's been under extreme turmoil over the last year, to say the least, with two disrupted school years. Parents and kids have lived through the most disruptive, the longest disruption in BC school history, which is saying something. And I think that school trustees and all of those involved, after such a long education dispute, were hoping for what even the Premier acknowledged was a time to heal in the school system. But the budget was quite a surprise to people who I think even had lowered their expectations quite a lot. Because in it there were $54 million of new cuts, which the government says is for administration. But of course, when a school board gets its funding allocation, the majority of its costs go towards paying professional teachers for providing the human resources which go into a classroom to teach our students. So this is going to be very, very difficult to manage. Nobody knows where those, how that budget will play out, where those supposed savings will come from. There are tens of millions of dollars of unfunded cost pressures for the school system. Things like medical service premiums, BC Hydro rate increases, those go right to the school district to heat those 1,600 schools all across British Columbia. There's all sorts of other costs that just rise by the level of inflation. And school boards too absorb the cost entirely by themselves of settling a support staff contract last spring. So they're out by tens of millions. Adding $54 million in new cuts, I think, is going to have real problems. It's certainly going to compromise the government's promise, the Premier's promise, to make class composition, supports for special needs learners, the government's number one priority. We're already seeing data that shows there's been no improvement.
Another issue related to schools I'd like to talk about is that of the seismic upgrades happening at schools or not happening. Tell us about that.
Yeah, this is a curious one as well, because we saw the capital budget for the Ministry of Education decline this year by some $90 million. There's never been a cheaper time to borrow since World War II. Capital borrowing is extremely cheap. There's a lot of work that needs to be done in BC. The Premier herself acknowledged that a couple of years ago, right on the eve of the last election. She made an explicit promise to parents and kids that, again, her number one priority at that time was making schools seismically safe. She said the timeline that was developed a long time ago by government to have every school completed to withstand an earthquake by the year 2020 was on track. And she also said that money should be no object. Now, what we've seen since the election is that there was an unlimited number of funds to fix the roof at BC Place. That was a $600 million project, even before it went over budget. And instead, the government announced just a month ago that schools will not be completed by 2020, that it's now looking more like 2030. And we don't even know if that timeline is realistic because there's no plan in place. So, it's curious to me because money's never been cheaper to borrow, but also because the engineering profession in BC has gained more and more expertise. These projects can be done more quickly, they can be done more cheaply than previously estimated, and instead government is slowing down the capital projects around seismic upgrading. I think it's unacceptable because we're talking about the safety, life safety of our kids. We know that we live on a fault line. We know that there will be a significant seismic activity. We've seen that. We dodged a bullet on Haida Gwaii. We've seen in Washington State and California what happens when infrastructure falls apart. We were reminded not too long ago in Christchurch, New Zealand, how devastating an earthquake of that magnitude can be. And we're due for one on our coast. So these delays are unacceptable.
Mm-hmm. So right now we're in the midst of the spring legislative session, and something that's been caused a little bit of controversy is Bill 11. And I'm wondering if you can tell us, first of all, what is Bill 11 and what are its impacts?
Well, it's got a very, sort of banal title, the Education Statutes Amendment Act, but Bill 11, I think, is something that every British Columbian should be concerned about, whether they're connected to the school system or not. Because what it really does is upsets the fundamental balance of power that one would expect in a democracy, and certainly in the school system, where you've had school boards and the ministry co-govern education for a long time. Government sets the broad policy objectives, issues the curriculum. They have a number of key responsibilities, including the providing the funding envelope to school districts. But school boards are the level of government that we trust to administer that funding. And they work under the, I think, wise constraint that school boards cannot go into deficit. They have to stay out of, financial trouble. And that's been the rule for decades. But what this bill does is it says if the province doesn't like the way the school district actually balances its budget, it's not enough to balance it. If they don't like the way it's done, they can fire them. In fact, it pretty much gives the minister any discretion to impose what are called special advisors to go in and intrusively overrule elected officials at the school board level, and also to look over their shoulder and essentially administer the budget that the ministry provides to them. So I think long term there's a lot of dangers here. One, it can be abused. It's a centralization of power. That's never a good thing. It could lead to abuse. But also, if you look at the education system in BC, I mean, where best practices and innovation and great new program ideas and inspirational examples of excellence in the school system come from, it comes from the local level, obviously, by necessity. And by centralizing more and more power and responsibility in the ministry and taking it away from local governments, I think we're upsetting a balance that we've had for a long time in BC.
So in addition to this, there's been other controversial sort of significant issues that have come up this session, and another one is regarding the Auditor General for local government. I wonder if you can talk a bit about what's happening there.
Well, nobody likes to say "I told you so," but the opposition, the NDP, told the government a couple of years ago when Christy Clark was running to be premier, and this was her big idea, was to have a brand new audit office specifically for local government that would be a standalone entity. The opposition said, "Look, by all means, increase the scope of what the BC Auditor General does, but don't create a new office. Let the Office of the Auditor General of British Columbia create a deputy auditor or something like that to be in charge of local government. Then you have the in-house expertise, you have the capacity, you avoid duplication, and you will be able to have a smooth startup to that operation." Instead, the Premier insisted on having it be a startup entity, and all the risks that come with that. And what we've seen in just a couple of short years is $5.5 million wasted, one audit report produced where there should have been 30, and we're getting no oversight over local government that was promised. So it's a complete failure. But rather than sort of now agree with those critics who said, move it into the Office of the Auditor General, they're doubling down and they insist that it's going to work somehow. They fired the person that they appointed, the board's in turmoil, there's audits of the audit office, never a good thing. So why they haven't just walked away and given the responsibility to the independent Office of the Auditor General is beyond me. It's what they should do.
Another issue that the opposition's been quite vocal on lately is that of land sale giveaways and parcels of land that have been sold for well under the amount that they were assessed for. And I wonder if you can talk about that.
Yeah, well, this is a huge concern. I mean, when the government decided that it would balance its budget going into the last election by booking something like $450 million in one time, i.e. unsustainable revenue sources, by selling off the province's assets in a fire sale rushed fashion, the government laughed off those concerns. And what we've seen from just one example of a large block of land sold in the Lower Mainland, which, for people watching this program at home will understand that the Lower Mainland is one of the most highly concentrated, high-value real estate areas on the continent of North America. To discover just the details that we've discovered so far as the opposition, that something like $130 million of appraised land was sold for around $80 million, that there was a $44 million shortfall in just getting to the appraised value. and that one of those parcels inside that envelope of land was a $6 million parcel sold for $100,000. You know, it begs further investigation at the very least, but what we're seeing that concerns us is that they rushed this sale. Mm-hmm. It was sped through, and it's the land I'm talking about is in a fast-growing part of Coquitlam on Burke Mountain. Not only did they sell it for less than what it was worth, we're probably going to see the prospect of government having to buy back some of the land that they sold at a discount, because they didn't listen to the master plan of the municipality. They didn't set aside land for, they're already two school sites short, for example. They're going to need other public services like health and other things. We're going to have to buy that back. And you better believe we're going to be buying it back at full market value. So when the Premier says that the education boards, the school boards should just go out there and find low-hanging fruit to achieve her government's cuts that they've passed down to them, school board leaders rightly say, look, we're efficient. And they look at deals like this and they say, you just left $43 million on the table in one land deal. Mm. So this is not a government that can really preach to the efficient levels of local government. Mm.
We're going to take a break in a few minutes, but before we
Sure.
do, I just want to ask you a little bit about healthcare, because there was a recent report that came out on healthcare wait times in BC, and I'm wondering if you can tell us about what that report said.
Yeah, this was by the Canadian Independent Health Statistics Agency, CIHI. And I think the concern here for British Columbians is that we're below the average on some key indicators around surgical wait lists. As British Columbians age and begin to use the healthcare system they've paid into their entire working lives, and want to have a quality of life and not be in pain and discomfort for an unreasonably long period of time, it's distressing to hear that, for example, for knee and hip replacement surgeries, British Columbia has among the longest wait lists in the country, and that they're growing even longer. We're way above the Canadian average. The same goes for cataract surgeries, a procedure which, by the way, has gotten much more simple to do, much more quickly. So I think the concern here is that, when this government, when the BC Liberals promised that it could do what no other province did, which is to essentially hold the rate of healthcare funding increases to below the natural rate of inflation within healthcare, and dismissed any problems associated with that. We're now starting to see big problems associated with that. People are not getting the services that they expect, that they paid for. Mm. And of course, when surgical wait lists grow long like this, it has a knock-on effect everywhere in healthcare. Mm-hmm. So, we're beginning to worry about this quite a lot. I think the opposition is going to press considerably about this, because, we've talked on previous programs about what it's like in emergency wards, what it's like in terms of long-term care placements. This is another major area of healthcare where problems are opening up that are concerning. Mm-hmm.
I know that the government's response to this has been to say that they, will study the problem, and it's been, some might say, 14 years of studying
Right.
the problem. It's still here. Do you think that's good enough for all the people waiting on wait lists in the province?
I think there's enough studies that show government some areas where they can address this problem. It's not a time to study it. It's a time to implement. The health authorities, to their credit, actually have their finger on the pulse about this. They have brought the attention to the ministry, which is responsible for planning and ultimately looking at some high-level resource allocations to make areas of healthcare that are not performing up to standard perform better. So that it's not about talking. It's about implementing and listening to ideas that will help improve budget performance, that will then drive things that are geared toward the patient. British Columbians should expect no less from their government.
Yeah. We need to take a short break. We'll be back in a few minutes on Constituency Report. Welcome back to Constituency Report on Shaw. My guest today is the new Democrat MLA for Victoria Swan Lake, Rob Fleming. Welcome back, Rob.
Good to be back.
Thanks. So I'd like to talk a bit about the recent oil spill that happened in English Bay in Vancouver. It's very concerning to many people across the province, and I'm wondering if you think the response to the spill was adequate.
I think there's a number of concerns around this spill, and we'll probably get more information in the coming weeks. But the first concern I have is that it was a recreational pleasure craft that discovered the spill, reported it, and then it took hours. In fact, it wasn't until the next morning where we saw booms up around the ship where the spill had originated from. So within minutes of the spill actually occurring, it was identified by a recreational boater, but it took hours and hours and hours for the Coast Guard to respond. Everybody believes, except for the federal government, that the spill response time was made worse by the closure of the Kitsilano Coast Guard base. And obviously that makes sense because it is minutes away from where freighters and bulk cargo ships typically anchor in Vancouver's harbor. So, you know, let's put it this way. This is a long way from the so-called world-class oil spill response regime that we were promised by Premier Christy Clark. So, what I think is that we've got a premier who has sometimes said the right things on oil spill responses. She knows that it's a key concern of British Columbians, so she knows how to address it from the rhetorical point of view, but has no record of achievement to show that we have made concrete steps, both in Vancouver's harbor or any other major vulnerable locations along BC's coast, to even take minor steps toward what you could call a world-class oil spill response system.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to spend the next part of the show talking about some issues happening in your community and things you've been working on. Yeah. So I understand you've been working on an issue related to home heating fuel. What if you can tell us about that?
Yes, a different type of oil spill, but one that's no less serious in terms of the local impact here in Greater Victoria and other parts of BC. Actually, right across Canada, there are a lot of communities like Greater Victoria's where there simply are a lot of oil spill underground tanks buried from a bygone era when, homes typically used oil and the practices were to bury them. That's not a good practice in a wet climate like ours, and it's one where we have seen an increasing number of problems: oil tanks bursting, and oil that was not supposed to get into the environment getting in there. And the concern is twofold. One, it is obviously about the environment. We've seen it go into fish-bearing streams and rivers in Saanich, the Saanich part of my constituency. The Colquitts has seen a number of serious spills there. Some near misses with salmon returns just missing the oil that flowed down and contaminated the stream beds. But we've also seen a lot of homeowners face financial ruin. A couple of reasons, and this is the piece I'm working on most actively right now with the Victoria Real Estate Board and a number of other stakeholders, municipal fire departments, municipal governments, the regional district, to try and fix a law which is really aimed at large industrial polluters and brownfield sites, but isn't very well aimed at local contamination events on a residential property. We kind of have this no-fault system that nails homeowners with 100% of the liability cost for cleanup, even if the spill happens through no fault of their own. An undisclosed tank they had no idea about, or what we've seen in some cases is a neighbor has an oil spill incident. It gets into their property. They're forced to sue their neighbor, even though neither party really is at fault for this spill. And it drags on and on through the court system, divides neighborhoods. Terrible results. So, like looking at Washington State and other parts of North America, they've dealt with this a lot better. They sympathize with homeowners who could potentially face bankruptcy if they get into large cleanup costs, hundreds of thousands of dollars, by having some kind of risk fund. And I think the regulations could be a lot better. We can make them better for the homeowner in terms of liabilities. The insurance industry doesn't cover this area, so it really is a liability that falls to the homeowner. And ultimately we can make it better to prevent these spills from getting into the environment in the first place.
I understand that transportation is a pretty big concern for a lot of people in Vancouver Island and Victoria specifically, and I'm wondering if you think the Liberal government's regional transportation plan is good enough.
Well, I mean, people listening at home, they can, the report is called On the Move, I think, the government recently put out, and there's this, great glossy photos in there, and the problem is that it's very, very short on details. And there's a couple of scant references to projects that are important to islanders, and some that I've championed as a local MLA. So I suppose it's good to at least have them referred to, because previously they were unacknowledged. One of them is redevelopment of Belleville International Ferry Terminal. This is a great area of economic activity that brings in something like 1 million passengers per year from 4 different private carriers right here in the Inner Harbour. It's a decrepit piece of infrastructure that government has neglected over the last decade and a half in particular. So it references that there is a need for this, gateway to our island community, and that there's significant economic benefits attached to it. The other is an unsafe intersection situation on Highway 1 around the Mackenzie intersection. So that is a dangerous area. ICBC tells us that it's the #1 crash site, I believe. Over several years of the last years, they've been keeping statistics. And people have been looking for a solution there to really a traffic failure situation, a congestion area that is beyond just being a bottleneck now. It's a traffic failure. So there's no timeline though in this plan. So just identifying the problems is one thing, but I think what people are really interested in is outlining a process and steps towards looking at some transportation investments that could really make a difference. And investments that are wise too. I mean, Victorians will want to have their say in these kinds of projects, and rightly so. They bring great ideas to it. We had a problem at the Sayward intersection at Highway 17. My colleague Lana Popham led a working group intervention that studied the problem, pushed the Ministry of Transportation to implement a solution, and that problem is fixed, and I'm hoping for the same thing at Highway 1. Now, beyond that, I'd like to see some more ambition, quite frankly, in the transportation plan. The Vancouver Island as a whole is 15% of this province's population, but it represents significantly more in GDP. We know that this government have been terrible stewards of our ferry system. We've never seen riderships this low for 20 years. And we're losing out on economic activity because of the prohibitive costs of getting to the island, both for tourism and the movement of goods and services. So nothing in the plan convinces me that this government still gets it, and that's unfortunate. So we're going to have to keep pushing on that.
We still have a few minutes left before we
Sure.
look at some photos, but I want to ask you about Budget 2015 that the government recently tabled. Is this a fair budget for, hardworking British Columbians?
I don't think it is at all. I mean, the #1 spend in this budget, if you will, is a $230 million tax cut for the top 2% of income tax filers in BC. People who make over $150,000, millionaires, I don't know too many of them, but nobody has told me, and I don't think anybody has, in the public record, in the discourse leading up to this budget, has recommended that the very best off in BC get a significant tax cut. What's the point? We have so many unfunded needs. We've just talked about healthcare growing wait lists. We've talked about the failure of the government to make progress on, say, class size and composition issues in the education system, to bring in special learning needs and support. There are so many needs that are actually the priorities of British Columbians. This tax cut wasn't one of them. And yet that's where they put the biggest allocation of resources. The other thing too is that while a millionaire gets a $17,000 a year tax cut, the middle class is getting dinged for all kinds of fee increases. Medical service premiums going up again, and over the next several years. Hydro rate increases significantly above the rate of inflation. On and on and on. ICBC rates, even though the claims record of government goes down, they're raising rates again. The middle class, where they pay fees to this government, is being asked to pay more and more and more all the time, while their public services are eroded, and the richest 2% of British Columbians get a huge break that they neither asked for, nor, quite frankly, do they deserve. So that's not going to create jobs. That's not going to get the economy moving. I think it's a set of misplaced priorities. And that was essentially the budget response from the opposition. And I held a forum with Carol James on that. We got a great turnout. I thank those who may be watching who've sent me messages of concern about the budget, which they saw tabled in the legislature in February. We're still debating that budget. That debate will carry on until the end of May. So if people do have concerns, it's worth presenting them still while legislators meet here for the next 5 or 6 weeks.
Yeah, absolutely. So I understand there's some photos that you have today, so I'd like to, maybe you can tell us a little bit about these.
Sure.
Be up.
Well, this is a recent tour of the Kool-Aid Society's housing project on Kerry Road, which is, kind of like a mature project now because it's a few years old, and just really successfully helping at-risk homeless residents, people who are really aging in our community and cannot be, placed in a shelter. And it's a wonderful facility, and I think the tour reminded me that we need many more like it. And this is speaking with a group of young people at Spectrum. They had what was called a living book day. So they had people who had some expertise. I presume they had a reason to invite me. But it was a chance for them to talk to a politician and ask questions. And there were great questions that I received that day. This is speaking to parents, kids, and some teachers recently at a rally held in Beacon Hill Park. It was, I believe it was called Families Against Cuts in Education. They happen in communities right across British Columbia. This was the one in Victoria, and it was an afternoon to sort of discuss some of the issues, but also our aspirations to have a great education system in BC and what that would look like. And this is a home heating oil forum that my counterpart in Saanich Southland, Papa, and I co-hosted recently. We're doing some follow-up activities. It was a wonderful forum, very well attended. We got a lot of good ideas out of that.
Wonderful. Rob, well, we're unfortunately out of time today, but I want to thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. And thank you for watching Constituency Report on Shaw.